What's up, guys? Welcome to JR Strength and Fitness, your friendly YouTube channel with all of your exercise science needs, your reaction what you want, and of course some exercise tutorials, because why the hell not?
You can say hello, but I don't need you to like.
In this video, I'm going to be breaking down a new meta-analysis that has recently come out of the Journal of Strength Conditioning Research. This is a publication that I receive every single month as far as having a membership with the National Strength Conditioning Association. It provides with new articles and publications that come out every single month. So I try to keep up with that and I read them all the time. Every now and then I come across one that I find very, very interesting, specifically in my realm, because a lot of times there are a lot of other articles or a lot of publications that have to do with a different sport that I'm not really coaching, like maybe hockey players might be, training patients with cancer or something. I don't train those kind of people in that population, so I don't necessarily need to focus too hard on those kind of publications. But every now and then there are publications that are broad for everyone that could possibly train, so I hone on those and I try to dial down the science that goes behind these articles and break them down in order for me to use them in my own application. I figured a cool way would be to walk you through the article, the publication, break it down how I kind of look at it, and then what we can extract from obviously the evidence and results that come from the meta-analysis and how we can apply that into our own training. But first, please hit the like button, subscribe button, let your friends know where you're getting this content from, and of course, always let me know what you think and how things should get better. But for the most part, let's get into it. The article was published this month in February in, like I said before, the Journal of Strength Conditioning Research, which is a very, very well-known research publication that has anything you can possibly need to know in the strength conditioning world. Today's article is Effects of Resistance Training Performed to Failure or Not to Failure on Muscle Strength, Hypertrophy, and Power Output. So this is going to be a meta-analysis, which means they pool together a bunch of different studies that have been done on or partially of the same topic, and then use that combined evidence and results in order to establish a overall consensus as far as the research goes. So that's what this meta-analysis is going to be about. I love meta-analysis because they kind of do the work for me in a way. They pull a bunch of research together in the literature, and they kind of have their own criteria, which we'll break down in this one, of how they go about, gathering different studies for that. All the time, when you kind of look at these studies, it looks like a lot of words that are just kind of thrown in. There's not much pictures. It's not like a coloring book or anything, but they do have a lot of graphs. They do have a lot of statistical visuals that we won't necessarily have to get into right now. We are just trying to understand the application of the science, and I'm going to break it down for you. At the beginning, I typically scan over the abstract, mostly because I want to understand exactly what the entire study has to be, if it actually is relevant to what I'm looking at, if they actually found some sort of result or consensus behind the whole research, then I'm curious about it, but I want to know how they got to it. So the first part is always a relatively long intro where they kind of introduce the topic, in this case, muscle failure, training to muscle failure. And they mention all the time that a lot of the normal consensus that is around there is that it's in a way superior as far as gaining muscle strength and hypertrophy. And they list out a bunch of different ways and a couple different ways and reference some studies that point to how this could possibly be possible. In the introduction, they always break down the research and the literature that is currently in consensus as far as the topic goes. We know off the bat, resistance training is very, very important if you want to get stronger and more explosive, specifically in sports performance, which is why the field has grown tremendously in the last couple of decades. And they talk about like how a lot of the consensus behind training to failure with these RM kind of lifts is that it seems to have some potential, quote unquote, potential benefits as far as increasing strength goes. And they throw in a bunch of different theories. For example, when you train to failure, there is the theory that you're going to utilize more motor unit recruitment, and therefore, as a consequence, you are going to increase neural activation, which is a huge component when it comes to strength. So the more motor unit recruitment I get, the more neural activation I need. The more neural activation I get, the stronger I get. And it's that kind of theory that a lot of the training to failure comes into play. Or in a sense, the heavy overload, heavy, emphasizing that heavy aspect. And a lot of this has to do with a theory, a very well-known theory called the size principle. And the size principle, the theory is that consecutive repetitions that are performed, the lower threshold motor unit fatigue and the higher threshold motor unit recruitment are maximized. So for example, like if I'm going to be doing some, bench presses, so if I go to that fatigue setting, initially during the set, I'm mostly going to utilize a lot of those lower threshold motor units. Those are the motor units that are sensitive to stimulation. So they're going to get activated no matter how heavy it is. And then once you get heavier, or once those start to fatigue out, then more motor units are needed in order to be recruited to help obviously produce that force needed to make the lift. That's the size principle essentially. But there's always some counter side, there's always some trade-offs, and they talk about how fatigue throughout the sets could possibly be detrimental to the overall volume. They talk about how EMG signals, which is the muscle activation when you put those electrodes onto you and they kind of measure the muscle activation, those tend to peak and stabilize before the corresponding muscle fatigue actually kicks in. In a way, there's technically some evidence that in the past that has shown that yes, training to fatigue may increase strength gains using the size principle. And as far as hypertrophy and power goes, the literature is relatively bleak. And then they get to the whole purpose of the article, which is the main point, which is what I kind of look at to see, does this article or publication match my curiosity? Does it match what I'm looking into, my demographic of who I train, etc., etc. If we look at the bottom of the introduction, we can see the purpose there. And they state the purpose of this article or publication is to systematically review randomized and non-randomized longitudinal studies on the effects of resistance training performed to concentric failure or not to failure on muscle strength, hypertrophy, and maximal power output in healthy young subjects and in older adults. Okay, so obviously we know the three areas that we're focusing on: strength, hypertrophy, and power. If you're looking for some sort of cardiovascular application, you're not going to find this article. So if you're looking for strength, then this article is probably going to be for you. And that's how you kind of wheedle through the kind of articles that you can read or don't necessarily need to read. So I will say, I do like how this meta-analysis was structured, how they went through the criteria, how they broke down the subjects, etc. So if we look at the methods behind it, they had certain criterias, and obviously we know that it's a longitudinal study of resistance training to fatigue or not to fatigue. And the duration of the studies are set as far as the minimum requirement that's needed as far as duration goes, equal to or greater than 6 weeks. This is what I really liked about the article and the publication. They even had the criteria of how hypertrophy is measured, how strength is measured, and how power is measured. So on the hypertrophy side, they needed ultrasound, MRI, or topography measurements. So pretty used. It's not like they're taking like circumference measurements of the arm or anything. These are pretty legitimate ways of analyzing muscle. And especially in that kind of deviation of muscle in that 6 weeks, small deviations in arm size might just be water. Essentially, those measurements help underline the efficacy behind the article. And then when it comes to dynamic strength, they use isoinertial tests such as the 1RM, 3RM, 6RM, pretty standard as far as that goes. As far as max power output, vertical jump, they even had plate load exercises, resistance exercises, but for the most part, vertical jump is a very standard power assessment. So overall, the efficacy behind how they criteria those three categories is good. And then the subject. So the subjects had 384 from 13 different studies, and 332 of them were about 21 to 26 years old. So a good amount of young people. And then 52 of them were 65 to 66 years old. Obviously a smaller amount, but still a pretty significant portion of the entire analysis. Having breaking down all of that, we know how the analysis was done, how they chose the different articles and studies that were done in this meta-analysis. And they also provided biases strategies for that, which I'm not necessarily have to get into right now. But for the most part, two things need to be true as far as these articles go: the efficacy and the reliability. So efficacy means that we're actually researching and measuring something that we can actually, that has to do with the article. The purpose of the article is to measure hypertrophy, yet I'm going to do like a weigh on the scale that's just like body weight, or you're going to measure hypertrophy by analyzing BMI. I don't think so. Think about it this way: if I wanted to know how good I am at riding a bike, I'm going to ride a bike. I'm not going to hop on the treadmill. Where's the efficacy in that? For the most part, you understand that the way we assess, the way we test, needs to actually have something to do with what we are assessing. So therefore, these tests have efficacy. Reliability is also a measurement that we must do in order to establish if the article is replicable. Can someone else do this exact same kind of assessment? Yeah, here's the criteria. Gather whatever information or studies you can, and it falls into the criteria, and therefore we have reliability. Okay, let's get into the result. Results are interesting. I'm going to just give it to you and then break them down. When it comes to max strength, we obviously were using 1RM, 3RM, 6RMs. Pretty good standards as far as measuring strength. So what the studies found, that overall there was no difference between training to failure and not training to failure. But there seems to be an advantage for strength gains when you are not training to failure, when volume is not equalized. So volume, for the next context of the whole result, is the sets, reps, times the weight. That gives you an overall load, and that load is going to dictate exactly how much more progressive overload do we have or not. So equated load, let's just say in a random number, 10,000 pounds. That's a, equalized level. If someone lifts 10,000 pounds and someone lifts, 15,000 pounds, or someone lifts like 5,000 pounds, those aren't equalized. So you can modify that, sets, reps, and weight, and all the other stuff. All the different studies had different ways of measuring that, so I'm not going to get into that in this video. But the main kicker when it comes to the max strength is that there was no difference when you equalize volume. So let me go over that again. There is slight advantage for strength gains when the volume is not equalized in favor of training not to failure. But that difference goes away when the volume is equalized. When it came to hypertrophy, training to failure seemed to have an advantage for increasing muscle size. So hypertrophy benefited from training to failure. Okay, however, there was no significant difference when you equalize volume again. When it came to max power output, again being measured by either the vertical jump or plate load exercises, there was an advantage for the group not training to failure. However, no differences were seen when volume is equated again. So across the board, you can see from the results that if someone was to take the initial statistical analysis, the meta-analysis, where they see that like, oh, technically, these studies show that strength gains are benefited from not training to failure, or like, oh, see, look, if you train to failure, you're going to gain more muscle size. No, across the board, the common denominator was the volume. So when you equated volume, there was no difference between training to failure and not training to failure. So overall, this kind of goes in with a lot of different studies that have been done analyzing how important the volume is. Progressive overload with the volume. Obviously, that's not to say that's just set in stone. That's the only thing you have to work on. But that is a huge, if not the most important aspect, whether you're trying to get stronger, whether you are trying to increase power or stack on more muscle. Overall, these three aspects, the strength, the hypertrophy, and the power, had no differences when volume we equate. And then after the results, at the discussion, which is typically at the end of the publication, I don't necessarily need to go into it heavily right now, but for the most part, they discuss exactly what they found, how the results kind of coincide with their hypothesis or other research that has been done on the same topic. They also even discuss how what their strengths of the article was, what their weaknesses are, what other studies after them could possibly do to make it better. They kind of break down all of that stuff. I don't necessarily need to go into that, but for the most part, we can obviously see that volume, when it's equated, has no difference. But if you're not going to equate the volume, then it looks like training to muscle failure might benefit increasing muscle size, and not training to failure might benefit strength and power. So the important thing is how to apply it though. I have fundamental principles of how I go about my training, how I train my clientele, how I myself train when it comes to training to failure. So I have a couple different rules. Because there's such a significant trade-off when it comes to training to failure, especially with compound movements, I do not train to failure in compound movement. That involves deadlifts. For the love of God, please do not train to failure with deadlifts. Squats, like the Olympic lifts, bench press even maybe. These movements have a very technical demand. Any sort of deviation from the optimal position might be catastrophic, either acutely or chronically in some sort of injury. So focusing on technique and intensity as far as like increasing load and not necessarily training to failure, you're going to be a lot better off as far as making sure you are in the right position every single rep. Because as you start to fatigue, because you get closer and closer to that failure mark, something up or down the chain is not going to be in the right position at the right time or do the right thing. It just doesn't work out so well. I know there are people that are going to say, but like, oh, but like some people can do it. Like, yes, you are right. I know that I myself can do squats, heavy back squats to failure, because I have done a million squats in my lifetime. But most people have not. Any deviation from fatigue or failure or just being neurologically wiped out might not go so well. So I'm not willing to take that risk with some people. And I feel like most people are probably on the same boat. So when do you train to failure though? Obviously, it seems that training to failure does have some benefit when it comes to hypertrophy, which is why I try to localize it. So things like bicep curls, leg extension, these are single joint movements. There's not much movement going on. In a back squat, it's a compound movement, which means you have multiple joints moving at the same time, from all the way from the ankles, knees, hips, even up through the torso. Things need to be coincide. So for the most part, there are many things that can go wrong. There's not much like wiggle room per se, but on a leg extension machine or bicep curl, the movement only occurs at one joint, which makes it a little bit easier to control and contain. Therefore, you can train to failure without having to worry about some massive deviation that might result in some sort of injury. For the most part, the muscle will let you know when it's freaking done. That's what training to failure is. So it's not like you're going to tear something per se by like maxing out your bicep curls. You tear your biceps when you try to curl something you should probably be deadlifting. I myself have utilized training to failure with these single joint isolation exercises, and I tailor these towards the end of a workout after I have focused on my compound lifts and I'm just looking for extra volume to increase size at a very local specific area. So the bicep, the leg extension, the hamstring curls, those kind of things, yeah, go ahead, go for it. It's not like you even have to measure volume per se, because you don't necessarily have a linear progression with the bicep curls like you do with a squat, or at least you shouldn't. So for the most part, you are trying to increase overall volume on the bicep curl. Overall, you're not going to increase volume per se on the bicep curl the same way. Therefore, there are other means of increasing the amount of size on the biceps. So A, overloading the compound movements, because yes, those utilize the bicep, and B, applying concepts like time under tension, isometric holds, negatives, training to failure, those kind of things. Yeah, you can implement those in those single joint exercises and go for it. I do the same thing. But when it comes to the compound lifts, leave the training to failure somewhere else and focus on getting heavy. You can even just do more of them. More sets is actually shown to have greater benefit to increasing strength. So instead of doing 2 sets to max effort, why not do 5 sets at like a 80% intensity, something like that. That's just an example, but you kind of get the point. Okay, so for the most part, this is just a kind of walkthrough of how I kind of analyze a publication or an article like this. Obviously, I can do more of them, but for the most part, this is an article that I found very interesting because it is a topic that has a lot of misconceptions in the world of fitness, especially the TikTok fitness of the world. But for the most part, these are principles you can utilize. Some people might think differently as far as training to failure. Like, believe me, I've heard physical therapists, professors have told me that the best way to increase muscle and increase strength is to train to failure. Right. Anyway, guys, I hope this video kind of helped you with your kind of exercise needs as far as breaking down the science goes behind some of these tough questions. So that's what I like to do. People will ask a question. People will have some sort of topic they have in mind, or they heard something from a buddy, and my job is to essentially break down the science for them and establish if what they have actually has some sort of efficacy behind it. So for the most part, I love this meta-analysis, and this is exactly how you're supposed to train. You train smarter, not harder. If you were training harder, you'd probably max out every single set you did. And yeah, you'd probably get your butt kicked, but that's not the point. You're trying to train smarter. When to train to failure, when not to train to failure. So I hope the video helped. Again, please like and subscribe. Let your friends know about me.
You can say hello.